Hi, everybody, and welcome to Because I Said So, a brief introduction on how to structure an evaluation essay. Of course, when we're trying to convince people to see things our way, whether it's about maybe a policy or a movie or a restaurant, it's not enough to just say, Because I said so, that's why you should agree with me. And that's why we write evaluation arguments. That's why we take time to develop our logic so we can lay it out and try to convince people, at the very least, to see that our position is valid, even if they don't ultimately agree with us. Now, the way to structure an evaluation essay can vary a lot depending on the subject matter of what you're evaluating, your purpose, your length, all that kind of stuff. But in a lot of general ways, it's similar to any other essay in that we have those three parts, the introduction, body, and conclusion. And generally speaking, they're still trying to achieve the same purposes. Let's talk a little bit about what those purposes are. For the introduction, the first thing you want to do is, built right into the name there, introduce the subject. And by this, I mean the subject is whatever it is you're evaluating. The movie, the song, the restaurant, whatever it may be. You want to introduce that right away. I recommend, generally speaking, that you'll want to introduce it in the first sentence. Now, there might be sometimes you don't, and we'll talk about a couple in a little bit, but kind of a good rule of thumb is that by the end of the second sentence, I should know what subject it is you are evaluating. Provide a brief summary if it's applicable. So if it's a movie or a TV show or a song or a play or a book or something like that, you want to provide a little bit of summary. And we want to be careful with this, not to provide too much, because it can get really easy to end up just summarizing a text and not actually evaluating it. So I recommend sticking to 1 to 2 sentences. And I think that's probably a good metric for throughout the essay. We don't really want more than 1 or 2 sentences in a row that tells us information we could know ourselves just by engaging with the subject. So just by hearing this song, I could know these things. Just by reading this book, I could know these things. We don't want to do too much of that. We just want to do enough to make sure everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. So a brief summary, 1 to 2 sentences that brings us up to speed. And then think about what we need to know about the subject's context or history in order to appreciate your position. If you're going to be taking an argument on this, you're going to be evaluating it and stating a judgment. Think about what we need to know in order to appreciate your judgment. That could be giving us information about the genre or category to which your subject belongs. Maybe if you're going to focus on a certain aspect of the subject, then it might be helpful to let us know a little bit more about that aspect. And again, I'm talking vaguely here because you could write a lot of different kinds of evaluations, not just the one we're doing in this class. So you want to think about it in just generally speaking terms, regardless of what you're evaluating. It's your job as the writer to think about, what do we need to know? What do I need to tell my readers in order for them to be able to appreciate my position? And that's not going into detail about your supporting points. Remember, supporting points come later. It's more about what do we need to know as background in order to listen to and appreciate your supporting points. In some cases, this might mean telling us that there is a debate about this thing. There is a debate about the quality of this thing. Some people hate this movie. Some people love these, shoes. Whatever it is, you might want to let us know that there are people who see this text or this subject differently, so that then we really are prepared for an argument. But that won't always be necessary. It's just that can be something you want to include in order to get us ready for your thesis statement. Remember that your thesis statement presents your overall judgment of the subject. I want you to kind of zoom out, look at it overall once you've considered all the criteria you're going to consider, and think, what is my overall judgment? We're not focusing on the specific supporting points here. You might reference them, or you might reference like groups of them, right? You might say the aesthetic of something plays a role, and then within the body of the essay, you go into details about the different types of aesthetics. That could happen, but we're not focused on listing our points here. Instead, we want to put the focus on your judgment. Here's an example. Witty and warm, Love Actually is the perfect Christmas movie. Now, it is. That's just a statement of fact. So I don't make the rules. But also, you see here that, yes, I'm probably going to talk about the humor and the warmth of the movie within the body of the essay. But the focus of the thesis, and maybe those aren't the only things I'm going to talk about, but the focus of the thesis is on presenting my statement, my arguable judgment of the text. That's what you want to do. Focus on what your arguable judgment is first, and then construct a sentence around it to function as your thesis. All right. Once you do all that, once you've presented your specific argument, we're ready to go into the body paragraphs. Body paragraphs are where you include your supporting reasons. This is where you tell us the why. Love Actually is the perfect Christmas movie because, and here's where I tell you the rest of that sentence. You're going to do a few things. You're going to have a few different criterion that you cover. And these things might take one paragraph or two paragraphs. There aren't a paragraph number set here. So if you're covering 3 criteria, that doesn't mean you have 3 body paragraphs necessarily. Things will, depending on what you're saying, depends on how long, how many paragraphs and how much attention it gets. But in all cases, the first thing you want to do is identify the criterion. So what is it, the specific criterion you're going to discuss? You want to explain why that criterion matters to the genre or category. So if I'm saying, if I'm going to be evaluating Chick-fil-A and I'm going to be talking about the speed at which I can get the food when I go through the drive-thru, I don't want to take it for granted that my readers know that speed is important. It might seem obvious, but for a fast food restaurant, I'm going to decide that speed matters a lot. But other people may think that speed doesn't really matter that much. That it's really more about the quality of the food, or it's more about how convenient the restaurant is, or something like that. So I have to make a case not just for my evaluation, but also for the criteria themselves. I have to explain why this criterion is one that really matters. Then I evaluate how well the subject scores on that criterion. So if I say with fast food restaurant, what really matters is how quickly you can get through the drive-thru, then I would tell you how Chick-fil-A did on that when I went through the drive-thru. And then I would provide evidence, either from the subject itself or from outside sources, the research you've been doing. I might include, maybe I timed the drive-thru, or maybe I found a research study that compared the average times of drive-thru wait times across a bunch of different restaurants. There's a lot of different things I can do. But that evidence would then support my judgment. So if I said Chick-fil-A is great with drive-thru, you go through really quickly, well, then I would need evidence to support that. You can't assume that we as readers will either A, know enough to be able to share your judgment on that criterion, or B, even if we do know enough, maybe we wouldn't land in the same place you do. So what you see here is that for each criterion, you really have to do a few things. And these things, again, aren't a 1-to-1 ratio with sentences. It's not like just 4 sentences. You might need many sentences to evaluate how well the subject scores on the criteria. The evidence might take half a page. But what I want you to remember, what I'm trying to say here, is that for each individual criterion you consider in your evaluation, you need to do all of these things. Remember that generally we want to rank the criteria in order of importance, which traditionally means, and we'll talk about some exceptions to this in just a second, but traditionally that means addressing the most important points first and giving them the most detail, spending the most time on them. So if I decide that the most important thing about a fast food restaurant is the quality of the food, then I'd spend the most amount of time on that criteria. I wouldn't spend a bunch of time on, say, like the mascot for it. I would spend my time on what's most important. And usually that means addressing the most important issues first. This is also an opportunity to address potential objections. And we could talk about this at length, but for now, just think about it this way. This is an argument you're making. That means people will disagree with you. If it weren't possible that someone could disagree with you, then it wouldn't be an argument. It would just be a statement of fact. So that means there could be very smart people who know all the same stuff you do, who just don't see it the same way you do. Addressing potential objections is when you say, some people might argue X, and this is why they would argue X, but this is what I say back to them. And that's where the key word there is address, because you're not just pointing out reasons people might have for disagreeing with you. You have to answer those disagreements. You have to show us why your position still holds up. You don't have to necessarily prove the other people wrong, because again, their argument can be just as valid as yours. You don't have to prove them wrong, but you do then want to prove why your position is still valid. Potential objections can happen within individual paragraphs when you're looking at criterion one by one, or maybe it's a whole section at the end or at the beginning. Somewhere in there, it's its own paragraph or two where you talk about the reasons people might feel differently. Then we get to the conclusion, that tricky paragraph or two. Usually people find this the hardest to write, so let's just I'm going to hammer this home until the end of the semester. You're going to hear me repeating this. Do not repeat the points you made in your essay in the conclusion. A conclusion is not a summary. It is not just repeating all the points you've already made. It's not a throwaway paragraph. Instead, this is where you zoom out. This is where you draw our attention to a larger context. That means a lot of different things. And again, the options are endless here. But let me give you a few examples that are probably the most common. Thinking, why does the subject of your evaluation matter? Or ultimately, maybe not matter. What I mean by that is maybe you've evaluated something and you've decided that it's not very good. Well, you can explain why, okay, it doesn't matter that thing's not very good because we have all these other options. Or maybe what you're saying is this movie was the best, superhero movie ever, and it matters because we want future superhero movies to pay attention to what this one did. That's a possibility. What you're trying to do is help us understand why the thing you have been evaluating was worth our time. You might also consider, what do you hope we'll do after reading your evaluation? If you're evaluating a restaurant, for instance, you might tell us, oh, you should go there on Tuesday nights because they have a pot roast special that's delicious, right? You might give us some kind of what we think of as a call to action, where you send us to do something based on your evaluation. You might also think about, what should we remember the next time we engage with the subject? And that could, again, engage with the subject is intentionally broad because you could be evaluating any number of things. But let's say you're evaluating a, Taylor Swift album. Well, then you might want us to think about something or remember something the next time we hear her music. So you might think about that as like, what can you put in our heads that we could be considering or keeping in mind when we encounter the subject again? You could also think about what your evaluation can tell us about the genre or category as a whole. If you've been evaluating this one pair of running shoes, well, you might back up and say, okay, well, based on this one pair of running shoes, now we know what matters the most about running shoes as a whole or shoes as a whole, right? You kind of zoom out and say, now we're not talking about this individual one anymore. We're talking about the larger genre and category. We're coming to conclusions about what your specific evaluation can tell us about those genres or categories. But be really careful here. A common thing we can do with evaluations is end up, and this can happen anywhere in the essay, but it does tend to pop up more often in the conclusion, we end up undermining our credibility. And what I mean by this is we say all this, we build our arguments, we make smart points, we integrate research, we develop our logic, we're doing a great job, and then at the end we say something like, or not, oh, you can disagree with me, that's fine. That's undermining your credibility. It's like you saying, well, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about after all. The thing about it is, we know we're getting your position, right? We know that it's an argument. We know that people can disagree with you. You don't need to apologize for having a position. This is when you present your position, you make your best case for it. And then what we do with it as readers is up to us. But if you go in there and say, well, maybe everybody feels different, that's what makes life great. Well, then you've essentially said, like, well, what was the point of this evaluation if your ultimate conclusion is that nobody's opinion really matters? This is your chance to argue in support of your judgment. It is built into the idea of an argument that people can disagree with you and might have other judgments. But we're reading this to know what yours is. So don't undermine yourself. Don't disclaim your opinion. Don't make it seem like you don't know what you're talking about. Now, of course, whenever we talk about organization, these are generalities and traditions, and there are a lot of alternative structures. And in case you're interested in moving into an alternative structure for this essay, here are a few ideas that can work well. The first is kind of the unexpected judgment approach. This is a case where maybe you had a lot of expectations for how you were going to feel about the subject, and then you went to evaluate it and you found that your expectations were way off. It's either it's better or worse, or even just way different from what you expected. In this case, you might use your introduction to describe what you expected, what you anticipated would happen with this subject when you engaged with it. And then you spend the body paragraphs detailing how it surprised you. What expectations did it not meet, or meet in such a different way you couldn't have expected it? You could also do a comparison. This works well if you are evaluating something that is maybe a lesser known version of something that is really, really well known. So maybe if I were going to evaluate a soft drink, I might compare it to Coca-Cola, right? We assume, generally speaking, that everybody's had Coke before. It's so well known that if I take my lesser known soft drink, something you've never heard of that's from some foreign country, and I'm trying to describe it to you, I might compare it both in the ways it's similar and different from Coke to kind of put it in a frame that would help you understand. So again, you really need a widely familiar example of the genre or category in order to do this, because you don't want to end up using another subject to compare it to, and your readers don't know what either of those things are. Well, then they'll just end up more confused. You might decide to structure it chronologically. That would be based on the order of the subject itself. Sorry, that cut off. Structure based on the order of the subject itself. So this works like if you're doing a movie or a TV show, you might decide to evaluate it in the order that it happens. Like you might have a song that you evaluate. Well, first you'll evaluate the first verse, then the second verse, then the chorus. You might evaluate it in the order that we encounter it. And then there's also the rebuttal approach. This structure works best when you're presenting an uncommon or unpopular judgment on a topic. You start out by presenting other people's views on it. This is why everyone loves this thing, or this is why people say it's not good. And then you outline why you disagree. So it's somewhat like the unexpected judgment, except in this case, what you're doing is presenting popular opinions that people tend to have, and then you're kind of going through those opinions and that logic to explain why yours is a better position, or at least an equally valid one. And then there's also the upside down. This is where you cover the least important criteria first. This can work, right? Get the little stuff out of the way. The big thing here is just make sure you still give more attention and thus devote more words to the points that you find most important. When I'm grading these essays, I'm going to be evaluating, assessing how clear your ranking is. And so that means I should always know what you consider the most important. So if it's not the thing that comes first in the body, then you need to make it clearly the most important in another way. Perhaps by not only giving it more word count and attention, but also by presenting it as the most important. Make sure I can identify which criteria are the most important. All right, I hope that this brief kind of overview of introduction of organization has helped you be able to kind of wrap your mind around these evaluation essays a bit more, and that you're able to get started planning your very own. All right, bye.